In the 17th century, another architect, Christopher Wren, covered London with 51 elegant churches. On his gravestone they wrote, "If you need a monument, look around you." That's what we're going to do. Look around us at the buildings in Sarasota designed by Edward Seibert in the 20th century and try to get the measure of the Seibert Effect. By the way, nobody calls him Edward. The world knows him as Tim. He's in his 80s now, trim, articulate, and with a clear view of what he was trying to accomplish during his working life. Listen to us now and judge for yourself.
I had no particular idea of becoming an architect till fairly well along in life, till I'd been at Stanford for 3 years. Someone said to me, "You're going to be working for a long time, you better find out something that you like to do." And architecture seemed interesting, so I threw everything I owned in a business coupe I had bought and drove to Gainesville.
Good architectural work is informed by those timeless aspects of design that Tim, for example, has always been so strong with.
A lot of his designs, if not the way they looked, they put into place the dream that John Ringling and Owen Burns had for both St. Armand's Circle and Longboat Key.
The man is, although he's not a teacher, he's not a professor like Paul Rudolph was, he's an educator with the people.
He always had a passion for Sarasota and for modern architecture and I think for the people that he built for and designed for, and I think that's really important.
And Tim Seibert's Tim Seibert. There's not anybody else like him.
I grew up in Sarasota back in the 40s. My father, who was a naval officer, went overseas right after Pearl Harbor, and this upset my mother quite a bit. So we put the names of places we had heard of in a hat and drew one, and it turned out to be Sarasota. And that's how I got here. My future wife was at Stanford. Not a very great way to pick a college, I guess, but that's what I did. So I went out to Stanford and passed the entrance exams and learned an awful lot. It was a wonderful, wonderful college, a great place to find out what the world was all about.
And from there you zoomed to Gainesville,
Yeah.
to the University of Florida.
Yes, and that was really the beginning of architecture for me. I had a rather checkered academic career. I had taken art courses. I had wanted to be a writer for a while. I didn't really know where I was going. And I had a professor there, Ted Fernie, who explained architecture to me very, very well. And it was the beginning of a lifelong friendship, actually. And that's when I really learned how to design buildings.
And graduated from the University of Florida.
In January of 1953.
And then what?
Well, I worked for various people in Sarasota. Sarasota was a tiny little place then, and one of the people I met was Paul Rudolph, who had just split with Ralph Twitchell.
I think in order to understand Tim Seibert and the Sarasota School of Architecture and what they did for the community, you have to understand what the community was like before they got here. I mean, basically, Sarasota stopped growing when the Great Bust at the end of 26. That was followed by the Great Depression. That was followed by World War II. So you had this town that was put into place in about 4 years in the mid-20s, and it stayed that way until after World War II. Well, the Sarasota School of Architectures led to a great extent by Tim Seibert, and what he did, they changed the face, the look of Sarasota. They made Sarasota modern.
I took some time off from architectural school, and my father-in-law gave me $2,000 to buy a couple of lots. You could buy waterfront lots pretty cheaply, then $1,000 a piece. And I built a little house on Siesta Key. And Paul several times came out and gave me critiques. And you've been working under the hot summer sun, building, for instance, a screen cage, and somebody comes along and tells you made it too short. And that is a critique that lasts forever. But I did finish it up and lived there for 30 years. And it's interesting because today there are so many rules and regulations that I couldn't have done that. This was a building that was built without any relation or communication with any government of any kind. There was no building department in the county then. There were no regulations. It later became, of course, highly illegal, the house. You could never do that again today. But I did live there for 30 years, mortgage-free. And when I got out of architectural school, I had won a minor prize for the house. So I was a brand new architect with at least some kind of a track record.
Tim is part of that group of professional architects who have been here and have spent their life working here and participating. Tim is important as a designer. He's a very talented designer. It almost goes without saying that Tim's understanding of light and shadow and proportion and all those timeless aspects of architecture has always been very strong.
I think he also adapted his designs to the Florida climate in his later work in ways that perhaps some of the other architects didn't or didn't have the opportunity to do because they didn't practice here as long as Tim did. His use of louvered blinds for shading or louvered shutters, if you will, puts a little bit of a kind of Florida twist on the very contemporary.
No, he's a strict modernist, and if it doesn't mean something other than to tickle the eye, he doesn't want it on a house. And so he stays with his values, and I think that's very important.
Well, Tim designed the first condominium downtown, the Gulfstream Towers. And he said, that look of around the basin there, around the bayfront, which is typically Sarasota's crown jewel, was to look like the basin in Rio de Janeiro. That's what they were shooting for. And he followed that up in 1982 with the Bay Plaza condominium, which is probably the premier condominium in downtown Sarasota.
It was nice having been a carpenter because I actually knew what I was drawing, and I don't think many architects do sometimes. It's all sort of theoretical to them. But when I drew a flashing, I had installed flashings and built post and beam houses, and I really kind of felt that I knew what I was doing.
Modern architecture since before World War II has developed along with the community, and much of the work of those post-war architects defined the community, defined the appearance, the physical context of the community. And of course, Tim Seibert was involved with that for decades.
It got its name in 1982 at a Florida Architects Convention in Tampa, Florida. And Gene Leedy called me up one day and said, "We're going to talk about the Sarasota School of Architecture." And I said, "Gene, there wasn't any such thing. What in the hell are you talking about?" And he said, "Yes, there was, Tim. Say it." So I said, "Well, all right." Then there was a Sarasota School of Architecture, and that was the theme of that convention. And now Gene Leedy kids me because I use the Sarasota School of Architecture as my own theme, but it was Leedy who really invented this. And the format was that Paul gave a lengthy and important lecture. Victor Lundy went on for something like, he was supposed to do 15 minutes. I think he went on for an hour and some, and there wasn't a boring minute in it. Vic is a great teller of his life about architecture. And then each of the Rudolph disciples got 15 minutes. Jack West, myself, Leedy, I can't remember who else. But then they took a picture of us all standing together. And that was when the idea of the Sarasota School of Architecture came about.
Well, I think Paul Rudolph and Victor Lundy are considered the top notch of the Sarasota School of Architecture. But I would put Tim Seibert right up there with them. If you look at what he has done, if you look at the amount of work he's done here, he ranks, to me, he ranks with them.
Well, I think Tim is an excellent architect in his own right, but I think his influence as an architect is enhanced by his ability to speak about architecture. So while Lundy and Rudolph taught by example, they did not have direct contact with the general public through the media. They built buildings, and those buildings were influential. But Tim Seibert has been an elder statesman for architectural interests in this town for 40 or 50 years, and he has educated a lot of people about what good architecture is, what modern architecture means, what honesty and clarity and use of materials means. And he's first and foremost educated me about those things. He's been a mentor to me, and the public needs someone who retains, who stays seated in the truth, centered on the truth, and centered on the values that he holds dear. About modern architecture. The public needs somebody like that to continue to educate them.
I think that probably what's really interesting to me is that his homes, the homes he's done, are some very grand, some quite modest. And I think it's wonderful that he was able to build smaller homes that would appeal to people of more modest means, and that they were able to experience great architecture on that scale.
Tim, especially with his participation in the community, understood. He worked with developers, he worked with individual clients, he worked with the politicians to build things that were meaningful to the community. That's where architecture really gets interesting, when it engages with the social and economic things that are happening at the time.
Frank Lloyd Wright would always be Frank Lloyd Wright, and his clients would want what he wanted and go to him. I think Paul was a great designer, and people usually went to Paul not to have their problems solved, but because they wanted what Paul produced. I was a different kind of architect, I think. I liked my clients, and I could produce, I thought, good architecture, which was quite different sometimes from what they thought it would be. The John McDonald house is an example of that. John and Dorothy had an idea of what they wanted. I made them a model of what they thought they wanted. We decided that was pretty ugly. Together, John knew nothing about architecture when we started, but he was a brilliant guy, very quick in understanding things. And it was a great joy to do that. And the product that we ended up with was something we really had created together. And I still think it was a great house.
When you see in an architect someone who can listen to a client and maybe change their own design ideas to suit the client's needs, then that's a real partnership, I'd say, between the two. And I think that was an area in which he excelled and continues to excel as a great communicator for us.
Dick decided to build a house. He called me up because we were friends. It was a 50-foot lot in St. Armand's, and I don't think anybody really thought you could build a house on a 50-foot lot, but we did. And Dick was a good client because he knew he had a sense of what architecture was about. He also collected paintings and art, very good stuff. And again, Dick and I were friends for years and years during and after that. The guy that built it was Frank Thine, for whom I'd done a number of other projects, and we were friends. So it was a situation of friendship, trust, liking, which is a very nice way to work.
He could bond with the client, or he'd want to, drop and kick him out the door, And I remember there was a client we had in there that was probably one of the funniest human beings I've ever been around in my life. That, he just had some very frustrating times with. And I remember one day, the guy was just complaining about everything he was doing. Tim just took all the drawings and wadded them up and threw them in a trash can. He says, "Get out of here." And 3 days later, the guy was back, and they were sitting down at the table working everything out again. But it was that type of relationship that you don't see a lot. You don't always just throw the drawings away and kick somebody out the front door. But I think it says a lot about the guy. And I think that probably reinforced their friendship, which they had at the time.
My orders on that from Phil were quite general, to build a air-conditioned glass box on stilts. And heretofore, Phil had been interested in designing around the Florida climate. This is hard for people to remember these days, but there was no air conditioning in residential buildings then. And so it made life as a designer more interesting, because you had to think about the climate and how to get the breeze to go through the building and how to make it livable. So I drew up a steel frame, and that was what we built. And again, that was a great learning experience. The guy that was the steel erector was a tough old bird that chewed tobacco and spat it in my wastebasket. And I made him this lovely drawing of how to build this curving stairway. He said, "I don't need no damn drawings like that," and threw them in the wastebasket and went out and did it just right, because he knew how. Well, you learn about people that way too. How to get along with the people that build things is interesting, because they're all different. And a guy named Frank Thine came into my office early on, and what he wanted was advice on a sailboat that he was going to buy, and I told him not to buy it. It wasn't a good boat, and we went out and had lunch together. And he was a PhD from the Sorbonne, a very philosopher type, and an interesting guy. We had a wonderful lunch. And he told me he wanted to be a builder. And I thought, boy, here's a guy that's going to have a problem. He doesn't know anything at all about building. So the first thing I did was a very small house for him, and I didn't draw it the way he told me to. I drew it the way I thought it ought to be. And he got the picture, because he was a philosopher and an educated man, and all that made sense to him. So then he decided to be a speculative builder. And I designed a post and beam house, and they built the model at Shade and Siesta. It's still there with all kinds of awful things done to it. And I thought, here's a way a guy can really, really lose a lot of money. I wish him well, but he wanted to do it. So he built it, and it was a raging success, both critically and financially. I think they built probably 20 or 25 of them around Sarasota. They're all over the place. It won an AIA National Design Award. It was featured in Better Homes and Gardens, a 5-star home. And later I pointed out to Frank that my contract said the drawings remain my property, so I sold them to Better Homes and Gardens for $2,000 and took him to lunch. And we went on building really nice buildings.
I think the seminal event in modern Sarasota was the arrival of Arvida in 1959. And they bought out all the holdings of John Ringling. And Tim Seibert got to be their man, basically, their chief architect. And he did a lot of work on Longboat Key. He did a lot of work on St. Armand Circle.
Well, I was the spinnaker captain for a guy named Johnny Ennis, who was a builder on his boat. We raced up and down the coast and to Havana and all around. And before I really got terribly serious about architecture, I liked to sail boats, still do. So he talked to John Siegel, who'd been sent up from the Arvida Corporation to run Sarasota, the vice president. He said, there's only one architect in the world that's any good, and that's Tim Seibert. Actually, he was thinking about setting sail. He didn't know much whether I could architect or not, and sometimes I didn't get his sails up when he wanted them either, but that was the introduction, and I did a tract office for John. One thing led to another. And as time went by, the buildings got better and better as we worked together better and better. And then I got to know Chuck Cobb, who ran Arvida, which was a great experience for somebody like me who has no corporate background at all, because then I was able to see how a real corporation worked and how really pleasant it was to do people like that. You know, I really felt they understood me and I understood them. Our office did, I believe, 81% of the buildings that were built on Longboat Key.
How about Sunset Beach?
That is one of the more architecturally successful condominiums, I think, on the Key. Because when I got to that, I could explain that maybe a condominium should be more like a resort and less like a bunch of places where you put old people. And I think that we were successful in the outdoor relationships between buildings. And again, a very good landscape architect named Rick Lamb, who teaches at Harvard. We've become friends too. He came down to do the land planning, the landscaping.
Now, Bayport was one of your projects also.
Yeah, I think that was probably the best condominium that I ever did. I like its severity. I like the plain white walls and the brown wood. And I lived there for about a year, and I found that the units were quite soundproof and very private. And as I say, the green trees, the outdoor spaces, the shadows, you know, to me are what make it into a very good piece of architecture. I've had boats all my life, and they've all been wooden boats, and let's see, 3 of them were designed by my father. I had a beautiful little sloop that was built in the mid-60s to my father's design by George Luzier. That was probably, in terms of points for being a classy boat, that was probably the classiest boat I'll ever own. She was a beautiful sailor and a beautiful little boat. So I had her built then, and I sailed her for about 7 years. And the practice was going well, and the guys, all their lives, I think, gee, I'd like to have a big boat and go cruising. I had a daughter by then. So I had George build me a cruising boat. And I was extremely lucky in that George and I had been in high school together. You know, we had complete faith in each other. So my father laid down the lines to that boat, and we did the sail plan, and that was about it. There wasn't much point in doing a lot of detail work for George. He'd been building boats of that type and size right along. We made a wild guess at an estimate, which came out about the way we guessed. And that was a happy year. He started that boat in October of, I guess, 1970. And a year later, we launched her. And I took off for Boca Grande. That was my first trip. I have finished a design for a 40-foot double headsail sloop, centerboarder, and entered it in a contest in Europe. I have scored twice in that contest. It's a magazine classic boat. It is written every country in the world, I suspect, by maybe 2 or 3 people. And it's just something to do, you know. I must confess, I have a secret thing going, that I'm really only 30 years old and I'm going to become a yacht designer in Europe.
Why not?
Why not, yeah. Well, I didn't go into architecture through any great bursting desire to give new form to buildings or anything. I just had because of my early youth, I was a pretty good carpenter. My father taught me, how to use tools, and he certainly taught me how to draft. And I had no great idea of giving form or great art or any of that. And I think that was a very healthy attitude. I love to draw, and I love drawing. And Lynn's son, who was a very bright young executive, said, he looked at my drawings and said, what kind of a machine do these come off of? And I held up a pencil. I said, you sharpen it with a knife. I wrote somewhere in some kind of an article that if a man ceases to have the ability of a 14-year-old to be that kind of person, he's doomed. And I'm still about 14 most days. Ask Lynn, she'll tell you. And that's the way to be. Yeah, well, we had a lot of projects, and by and large, I think most of my clients became friends afterward, and I enjoyed their company by and large. And at one point in my career, we were doing a lot of wintertime houses for rich Yankees, and I used to visit them up there, and go to the shows in New York or the yacht clubs in Rhode Island, and have a fine old time designing houses. It was a good life. I really have no regrets. I think that I was able to use the talent that I had to its fullest extent. Good architects have to be quite different. Victor Lundy is very different from Paul. I think Vic is the most talented man I ever knew. Just a natural talent. Paul was developing a new architecture. And he hoped, when he died, to have a full file drawer at the Museum of Modern Art, and he got it. I had no such desires. I always knew who I was, even when I was a bad boy.